Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 30 of Series 7. The question for today is, can we find criteria that we can use to determine the priority of values? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 9. So last week we considered the possibility of human objectives in consciousness, cognition, affect, will or value. In particular, we considered their expression in knowledge, truth, happiness, the will and ethics. We concluded that none of these are adequate, but that the realm of value offered a potential goal. This week we have the more difficult and crucial task of working out criteria for determining the priority of values. The difficulty of this has been shown in other discussions and in contradictions between theories of ethics. Nietzsche emphasizes the point in stating that the future task of philosophers is to determine the rank and order among values. Nietzsche agrees about the importance of both values and the question of the priority of values. Heidegger and Sartre believe that the question of priority has been largely answered in the question of being. But I expressed my doubts about that priority last week. Yet Nietzsche understates himself in allocating the ordering and ranking of values to future philosophers. In other works, he and other existentialists are already embarking on the question of creating new values, and rank and hierarchy have also given way to radical revisions of value and questions of coherence. Similarly, my objective isn't just to find the order and rank among values, but to produce new values. My contribution is to look for different kinds of sufficient value that answer questions of life. Sufficiencies of value are states like moral fortitude, magnanimity, patience and self-esteem. Yet these sufficiencies are also insufficiencies of value which call for further value. Hence the principle of the will to value and the value of value. But I first want to remove a number of orthodoxies that stand in the way of this project. These are major concepts that I can only outline here rather than mount full criticisms of. These are the principles of unity, hierarchy, universality, freedom, cost and knowledge. The first of these is the assumption of the unity of value and moral values. This is the orthodox view in religion and from the ancient Greeks through to Kant in the Renaissance. This unity begins to break down with figures like Machiavelli, Herder and Nietzsche, and value pluralism is expressed more explicitly by Isaiah Berlin and Bernard Williams. Postmodernism argues for the fragmentation of values for more ideological reasons. But in my view, conflicting and competing moral goods or values is a fact of life. We similarly don't want to reconstruct a hierarchy of values, particularly on questionable presuppositions. One such presupposition is the idea of one value that can determine all others in all circumstances. That is, notwithstanding my advocacy of certain value preferences in favourable circumstances. The incommensurability of some major values also counts against hierarchies of value. I next want to consider universality as a criterion of priority for either value or moral value. Universality is central to Kant's categorical imperative as a criterion of morality and moral value. We might agree that something must be universal in order for ethics to be valid. But Kant's universality also refers to the material content of action that's problematic in a complex and diverse world. That is, universality as determining correct action in every conceivable circumstance is unattainable. An even more esoteric application of universality is the idea of eternal values as a form of legitimization. Eternal value is a quasi-religious idea that's intuitively attractive but doesn't survive examination. Both Nietzsche and Sartre reject justification by reference to a future or a past. Isaiah Berlin compared the desire for eternal values to a craving for the certainties of childhood. Yet potential for error goes beyond a lack of appreciation of different values for different times and circumstances. It extends to a lack of appreciation of what does not exist when consciousness does not exist. And that not only values but also their criteria are brought into existence with the development of consciousness. This problem can only be resolved with an understanding of consciousness and what it brings into the world. Existentialists and phenomenologists have studied consciousness but without resolving the issue of value. Freedom is another criterion considered essential to value, emphasized by Kant, Sartre, existentialists and others. Freedom or free choice is a precondition of moral value as well as affecting the quality of that value. But the contingency of freedom as a cultural preference challenges it as an essential criterion. That is, value, or even great value, can be experienced in the absence of freedom. And preconditions such as free choice in moral value aren't necessarily valuable. For example, water is a precondition of life, but water isn't necessarily valuable. Lastly, I want to consider cost as a criterion of value. That is, when value is determined by the price or cost paid. This may be a realistic account of value in commerce, psychology, or even in Christian atonement theory. Cost theory of value even seems to play a part in Sartre's theory of value as lack, need, or desire. But again, there are many instances of value not explicable as cost, for example, in love or magnanimity. These properties of unity, universality, timelessness, freedom, and cost are often regarded as essential criteria of value, but they can also be considered as inadequate and misleading, pointing away from more appropriate criteria. I will start by discussing two of these, namely intrinsic value and the internal-external distinction. If equally weighted, intrinsic values have priority over attributed values almost by definition. This is because intrinsic values are values in themselves, whereas attributed values have value assigned to them. But particular instances of what have intrinsic value are much debated. I myself argue that only mental states and conscious beings are candidates of intrinsic value, and among these, only positive value states that affirm value are of intrinsic value. Examples of such positive value states are love, self-esteem, and courage. Now, these are also examples of value sufficiency that I have designated as a primary human objective. But the ascription of intrinsic value does not resolve questions of priority or adequacy of value. This is because there are degrees of intrinsic value and many intrinsic values are trivial. For example, the love I have for my wife is of greater intrinsic value than my love for my dog, and the intrinsic value of watching a football match isn't an adequate life objective. To summarise, I previously argued that all sufficient values are intrinsic values. This is because they are apparently self-valuing, but not all intrinsic values are sufficient values. Or put another way, intrinsic value is a necessary but not a sufficient condition of sufficient value. That is, we still need other criteria to determine the priority of value and the adequacy of value. Another of these criteria to discuss now is found in the internal-external distinction. Kant was acutely aware of the problem of trying to integrate subject and objective elements in his ethics. He wanted to retain the subjectivity of intention, freedom and choice, as well as ethical objectivity. He attempted to do this with the capacity of reason. This is because reason is both objective and subjective, or we could say internal to the agent. The issue can be clarified with the recently discussed internal-external distinction in the form of reasons for action. Bernard Williams, for example, discusses the question with a certain skepticism for external reasons for action. Yet John McDowell considers the question of whether external reasons for action are possible. But we can use the internal-external distinction in an application to value and values. The problem for Kant is that reason is internal to the agent, but is external to value and values. This externality of reason to value is explained with the fact value and Hume's is-ought distinctions. So Kant's problem is mandating moral values by external reasons of universalization and a certain conception of things. But virtue theory finds internal reason for actions because it is internally motivated by character and disposition. What we need to do is to find criteria that are internal to value that nevertheless provide normativity. I don't use the words objective or universal for criteria that are subjective and are brought into the world by consciousness. So I now want to outline such subjective and internal criteria that provide normativity, such as coherence, consistency, quality, choice, truth, and crucially self-validation and sufficiency. Coherence as a criterion of value is expressed in many ways. In ethics, it's a belief in an underlying moral order, as noted earlier. For Aristotle, it's a unity of the virtues in which one virtue can't be enjoyed without the others. In religion, God is a unification of the believer's highest values. Note that all the above are essentially grounded in value and affect the quality of their values. And G.E. Moore and Robert Nozick determine both priority and intrinsic value with its degree of organic unity. For reasons that will become clearer, I think that organic unity would be better described as coherence. On Moore's and Nozick's view, higher degrees of organic unity are of higher intrinsic value. And of particular interest to us, intrinsic value is ostensibly an internal property. But as Nozick points out, organic unity can also be a property of negative events, for example, in the form of concentration camps, wars, and heinous plans to commit evil. But there is also the problem that some of these unities are external structures. Yet the problem of negative events is due to moral conventions which need not affect structural claims. And manifest undesirability is due to the objectification of value in material forms, of which Nozick is liable. So, as an internal property outside moral conventions, organic unity or coherence can still work as a criterion of value. As such an example, the idea of God is a mythology which brings coherence to a subjectively significant belief. This subjectively significant but amoral aspect is even better illustrated in the opposite idea of Satan. Satan represents the coherent but negative value essential to a comprehensive religious view. In my own account, valuing value has a proclivity towards both coherence and sufficient values, and this process might be compared to Aristotle's teleology towards his own conception of the good. This is because valuing is a process that has trajectory and directional content that aggregates value. Conversely, the pursuit of diverse and unrelated material objectives can dissipate value. Consistency is another possible criterion for the priority of value that is related to the idea of coherence. Consistency here means reduction of psychological, ontological, or theoretical gaps or fissures. Yet my forthcoming examples only work given their conscious recognition or unconscious effects. And it might be easier to start with the examples of internal inconsistency. I'm thinking about examples like anxiety, alienation, guilt, bad conscience, and Festinger's cognitive dissonance. We can also include moral contradictions and conscious breaches of Hume's is-ought distinction. Yet my favourite examples are found in Sartrean concepts like inauthenticity, bad faith, and the spirit of seriousness. For example, inauthenticity is found in acting out or pretending to be someone that we are not. Bad faith is seen in avoidance of choice and freedom when we are condemned to choose and to be free. And the spirit of seriousness pretends that subjective values are objective to avoid freedom and responsibility. Yet we need not agree with Sartre's exaggerated framing of these examples in order to see their merits. That is, they illustrate internal inconsistencies of value and do so more explicitly than religious counterparts. Sartre also explains both his preference for subjective over objective values and the status of that preference. For example, he gives the advice of refraining from appropriating things for their own sake, and his imperious condemned to choose indicates inescapability rather than necessity. Moreover, Sartre has views about the foundations of choice, value, and authenticity that extend their consistency. That is, their consistency is extended from relations within consciousness to their foundations. And in doing so, their significance is extended from psychological preference to an ontology. To make the point very briefly, Sartre writes that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. He adds that choice isn't just a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. But Sartre doesn't actually provide an analysis tracing choice back to its ontological foundation, but we can fill in by saying that contrast is a form of selection essential to cognition and thereby to consciousness, and that contrast and selection are expressions of choice that produce value of different kinds. The simplest example is that a white spot on a white board can't be seen because it needs a contrast. But this is only the briefest outline of theoretical, psychological and ontological consistency. Another expression of consistency is found in truth that we can discuss now. We usually understand the concept of truth as something objective, and for that reason, truth can be thought of as something that imposes consistency on our thinking. Last week, we eliminated cognition as knowledge from being an adequate realm for a human objective. But we can look at cognition in another sense as a criterion of value in the form of truth. Last week we were also presented with a subjective conception of truth, yet that subjective conception of truth nevertheless imposed certain constraints. That is, Kant, Popper and others define truth as a regulative idea because it's unknowable yet offers corrections of falsity. And I have previously argued that indefinability of both truth and the highest moral good is fortuitous. It's fortuitous because truth and the highest moral good share a property that regulates values, and that property is possibility or absence, which beckons value to further value. Yet an absence or attenuation of cognition has other implications for value. That is, an absence of, say, social endorsement in the case of moral fortitude. What we see here is that value and moral value are related to truth and have a certain symmetry. That is, they both not only have inescapable claims on our will, but they are both indeterminable. To qualify this, one aspect of More's naturalistic fallacy was that the moral good cannot be adequately defined. I disagree that we can't define the character of the moral good, which I do define in terms of value. But I agree that we cannot definitively define the highest moral good. This is because it is, like truth, always liable to reformulation and further discovery. The point here is that truth and value, or moral value, share the features of absence and indeterminability. And this comparison and symmetry of truth and moral value leads them to evoking similar kinds of value. This is because values are largely determined by the objects that they value. The outcome isn't just that truth isn't ideal and a regulative constraint for value, but that absence in the senses given is a criterion of both truth and value. The concept of logical truth implies a priori knowledge that I rejected as a foundation of value last week. Yet a priori knowledge is internal to logical truth, and we're also looking for internal criteria of value. And we can look for internal criteria of value that are self-validating rather than a priori knowledge. Self-validation can be established in logic and mathematics by non-contradiction. But a priori or self-validating principles are not thought to be possible in physics or ethics. Referring to value, I prefer the term self-validation rather than a priori, which has epistemological connotations. For example, logic is determined by the self-evident and self-validating truths of Aristotle's 4 basic principles of logic. David Hilbert described mathematics as avoidance of contradiction and is therefore a self-validating a priori. And a self-validating system within the human sphere is Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Physics isn't self-validating because it's an a posteriori system of contingent observations. Importantly, mathematics and logic are self-validating but can't establish principles for systems of physics or ethics. Conversely, if systems of value can be self-validating, they might be able to offer criteria of value. By way of illustration, Heidegger describes the will to will in a similarly self-validating way. He writes that the will to will forces the calculation and arrangement of everything for itself, and the will to will provides an introduction to the will to value that I explain elsewhere. Bernard Williams makes a similar point when he says that Nietzsche rightly claims that morality in this wide sense demands to be understood as self-sufficient, and Ronald Dworkin speaks of a positive aspect of Hume in an independent realm of value. Yet all these references are about morality or values in general, not about specific values. However, Kant unexpectedly anticipates this deficit and says that we have then to develop the notion of a will which deserves to be highly esteemed for itself and is a good without a view to anything further. But just prior to this statement, he says that such an end should be determined by reason only, that we have rejected earlier. Following that statement, he says, to do this, we have to take the notion of duty, which includes that of a good will, but it is highly contested that duty is equivalent to and nothing further than a good will, and it is also a shortcoming not to interpret duty and indeed the good will in terms of value. My solution lies in a principle of value as an affirmation or will to value or value of value, and that such is self-validating also because the alternative is contradictory and self-negating. Moreover, the will to value leads to a sufficiency of value which is a value in itself, and the will to value and value sufficiency are thereby criteria that become principles of value. To begin with, to avoid a misconception, the will to value as the value of value isn't a tautology as might be thought. It isn't a tautology because value can affirm value or not as the capacity of reflective consciousness, and it's not the material content of values that is affirmed but the aggregate existence of value. Yet the affirmation of value can be done in at least two ways. One is the affirmation of the realm of value over others like cognition, as argued last week. Another is that value must be affirmed within its own system of value in order to value anything, and in a way comparable to the I think therefore I am, value itself presupposes the will to value, and therefore not to value value is contradictory and self-negating. Yet not valuing value, which you may have chosen as the best option, can be self-contradictory in different ways. As above, not valuing value is a denial of the capacity of value by which you are denying value. Not valuing value can also be a denial of an aspect of consciousness which we can't escape. And not valuing value can be a denial of a positive principle which is regressive. But again, these contradictions can be either external or subjective and internal, which we need to specify. In addition to the early examples of negative value states, We also noted Sartre's repudiations of the spirit of seriousness, bad faith, and inauthenticity as denials of choice, freedom, and reality. The avoidance of choice and freedom as bad faith can be viewed as regressive, and denial of choice can be interpreted as a negation of value. On this account, internal features like bad faith, inauthenticity, and denial of choice are valid criteria of value. Yet there are other criteria of value that are valid, but only applicable if the agent is aware of them. And in this case, not to value value is contradictory, self-negating, self-defeating, and erroneous. Firstly, it's erroneous because of beliefs about objective values and about relations between value, choice, and consciousness. Yet these points may be a matter of philosophical dispute, as well may be the following previously argued points. That is, 1. Not to value value is self-defeating because value is arguably the culminating state of human satisfaction. 2. Such is self-negating because, as above, value must be presupposed by any system of value judgments. 3. A refusal to choose is a negation of value because choice is a fundamental property of value and consciousness. And 4. Consequently, it is contradictory because it opposes value, the value of value, as a self-validating principle. But these 4 points are usually external features which have to be recognized and chosen to be criteria of value. So we must pay attention to the faculty of choice in a determination of priority and criteria of values. There is no need to discuss the question of free choice, as choice is an adequate determination here. But before discussing choice, we must think about quality as one of the reasons for choosing. This is because the above discussion presents 2 kinds of self-validation. One is because the alternatives are contradictory, self-negating, and self-defeating. Another is due to the inner character of the state, such as in logical a priori, but not applicable here. Or it's due to characteristics like quality that we have to discuss now. So one of the key features determining the priority of value is its quality. And the quality of value will be determined by all the factors noted above as well as others. And this may make quality an amorphous property, yet not less any significant for that. And it also averts the tendency to see values in terms of quantification or maximization. The quality of value will also be largely determined by its object or objects, and those objects might be considered significant, like truth or God, or insignificant, like apples and pears. Or as noted earlier, they can be determined by the attenuation or the near absence of cognition. Yet these multifarious and amorphous criteria, quality of value, has been given some definitive formulations. Kant, for example, argued for the quality of the intention of the goodwill as the primary criteria of morality. For Kant, moral action needs to be free, informed, and without constraints or inclination. Sartre tells us that the qualities of the ego represent the ensemble of virtues, latent traits, potentialities, which constitute the character and our habits. More exotically, Robert Pirsig discovers the principle of quality in his Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Pirsig sees quality as excellence in human artifacts, but he neglects quality both as a value and as a value state. Yet in my account, quality is one of the major criteria in the determination of the adequacy or sufficiency of value. And quality also guides choices made in the affirmation or will to value as the value of value. So we must now briefly look at this faculty of choice. We have outlined a number of criteria for determining the priority of values, but for either values of life or morality, most of them can only have significance if they are chosen, and the suggested criteria of choice were supposed to facilitate that choice. But that choice is also imponderable. We might demonstrate that choosing value as the will to value is the inexorable outcome over the will to will. But that choice is still dependent on something even more fundamental, like a choice for existence. To make that choice for existence, we might say it's better to exist than not to exist, or it's better to be a human than a chimpanzee, or it's better to have a healthy mental life of a 75-year-old than a 25-year-old. These are fundamental choices for existence that are difficult to justify. Against Schopenhauer, existentialists like Nietzsche, Heidegger and Sartre do make the case for existence. Sartre puts it in terms of knowing that the goal of our pursuit of being. But this is too vague. Yet he also describes an original choice that isn't a selection from pre-existing alternatives. It arises simultaneously with consciousness as a choice for being and consciousness. But Sartre doesn't give a detailed account of this original choice. So one of the most elusive yet crucial aspects of determining a priority of values is that they are subject to choice. We can choose our values carefully or in ignorance or indifference to various constraints. Many values are, however, entrenched in genetic, social or ideological edifices. But nevertheless, in principle, if not in practice, all values are eventually subject to choice. And moral values must be chosen or they are not legitimately moral. Yet we began this account by noting several criteria which we should choose with great skepticism. These were features like freedom, cost, universality and timelessness. Others like objectivity, providence and authority didn't make it far enough even to be rejected. We saw that choice as selection is not only a human capacity but lies at the foundations of consciousness and value. But this has led some existentialist accounts to present freedom and choice as open and without restriction. I hope that this paper has been able to redress the balance between these two extremes. That is, between a complete determination of values as fixed and objective and the postmodern belief that there are no valid criteria of normative values. We began by wondering how we could find internal and subjective criteria of value that enabled normativity. In conclusion, we are overwhelmed by such a proliferation of criteria that we can't discuss them all. Yet we can repeat the question, can we find criteria that we can use to determine the priority of values? Against both dogmatic objectivists and the relative postmodernists, the account above shows that we can. But we must understand the strengths and weaknesses of both the objectivist and subjectivist positions. As John Mackey has shown in his arguments against objective values, values aren't objects that we can just take off the shelf. They are subjective states produced and chosen by human beings. And this is why we must know what criteria we can use to determine values of life or of ethics. I eliminated unity, hierarchy, universality, timelessness, freedom, cost and objectivity. And in brief, I proposed the internal criteria of coherence, consistency, truth, quality and self-validation. Yet the principles of the will to value and a sufficiency of value could also be taken as criteria of value. Yet ultimately, most of these criteria must be chosen in order to affect the quality and priority of value. Some criteria need not be chosen because they have unconscious or causal effects of certain conceptions. Yet such factors bring a wide variety of things to our attention that can influence our choices. And for this reason, we must be informed about valid and invalid reasons for choosing criteria of value. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on a website like Zoom or meetup.com.